She kept repeating the same question over and over until Karoline had enough, and what happened next stunned the entire room. The briefing room in Washington, D.C., was packed, with a row of cameras lining the back wall, their lenses locked onto the podium where Karoline Leavitt stood, poised and confident. She was no stranger to tough crowds, but today felt different. There was an unspoken tension in the air, humming beneath the surface. Adjusting the microphone, she began, "Good afternoon, everyone. Let's get started." Immediately, hands shot up across the room, journalists eager for a headline, racing to ask their questions first. Karoline pointed toward a familiar face, a reporter from a major network, who inquired about the administration's latest tax policy. She answered smoothly, delivering a well-rehearsed response, then addressed another question about education reform without hesitation. This was routine: stand firm, control the message, and navigate the press with the skill of a seasoned professional. But then, it happened. A sharp voice cut through the room. "Ms. Leavitt, let's talk about the real issue here." Karoline recognized her immediately, the liberal reporter who was always aggressive, always pushing for controversy. Seated near the front, she leaned in with a smirk, her pen tapping against her notepad. Staying composed, Karoline responded, "Go ahead." The reporter didn't hesitate. "Do you think the administration's policies are intentionally designed to suppress certain communities?" "Because the data suggests," Karoline raised a hand. "I've answered that question before. The administration is focused on policies that benefit all Americans, regardless of background. If you'd like to discuss today's topic, I'm happy to continue." Murmurs rippled through the room, but the reporter wasn't finished. Leaning in further, she pressed, "You didn't actually answer the question, though. Can you directly address whether—" "I did answer," Karoline cut in, her tone firm but controlled, glancing at the other journalists to signal she was ready to move on. For a moment, the room seemed to settle, as if things might return to normal. But then, the reporter's voice sliced through again. "I just don't see why you're avoiding it. It's a simple yes or no. Are these policies suppressing marginalized groups?" The temperature in the room shifted as reporters exchanged glances, some intrigued, others visibly uncomfortable. No one enjoyed watching a press conference turn into a showdown, but that was exactly what was happening. Karoline exhaled slowly. "I'm not avoiding anything. I'm staying on topic. If you have a question related to today's discussion, I'll gladly answer. If not, I'll be moving on." But the reporter wasn't backing down. Leaning even closer to the microphone, she pressed, "So that's a no comment?" The energy in the room tightened, the weight of the moment settling over everyone like a heavy fog. It was no longer just a press conference, it was turning into a spectacle. A hush fell over the room, not an empty silence, but one that felt charged, like an elastic band stretched to its limit, waiting to snap. Karoline adjusted her stance, placing both hands on the podium. "I've answered your question. I'll be moving on now." She pointed to another journalist in the back, but before they could speak, the same voice cut through again. "Why is it so hard for you to give a straight answer?" A flicker of irritation crossed Karoline's face, not much, just a brief tightening around her eyes, but enough for those paying attention to catch it. She wasn't new to this. She understood that reporters had a job to do, but there was a clear difference between pressing for accountability and using an event as a personal stage, and right now, it was obvious which one this was. A few cameras shifted their focus from Karoline to the reporter, capturing every subtle movement, every shift in body language that could be twisted into a headline. Karoline inhaled deeply through her nose, steadying herself. "I don't believe in wasting anyone's time. If you have a new question, I'll answer it. Otherwise, I'd like to give others a chance," Karoline said, her tone even but firm. The reporter smirked. "Sure, new question. Why is this administration so afraid of transparency?" A few quiet gasps rippled through the room, and some reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the moment escalating. Karoline gave a slow, measured blink, the only sign that the remark had landed. Her grip on the podium tightened for a second before she let go, exhaling just slightly. Then she smiled, but not the warm, diplomatic kind. This was different. This was a smile that said, "I see exactly what you're trying to do." She took her time before responding. Transparency? That's exactly what this administration stands for. But what you're doing isn't about transparency, it's about theatrics. The words hung in the air, heavy with intent. For the first time, the reporter's smirk faltered just a little. Another journalist, seated closer to the back, cleared his throat. "Karoline, if I could," but once again, the same voice cut in. "So you're dismissing valid concerns as theatrics? The American people deserve real answers." The cameras caught everything, the slight tilt of Karoline's head, the way the other journalists shifted in their seats, some clearly frustrated that the event had been hijacked. A veteran journalist, someone who had covered politics for decades, leaned back and muttered to a colleague, "This isn't journalism. This is performance art." But the reporter didn't care. She knew exactly what she was doing. The longer she dragged this out, the greater the chance it would go viral. A confrontation like this? It was social media gold. Karoline saw it too, and in that moment, she had a choice: engage and fuel the spectacle or shut it down completely. With a quiet sigh, she finally glanced toward security standing at the side of the room. She didn't have to say a word, the shift in her gaze was enough. The room tensed again. Everyone understood what that meant. This was no longer just a heated exchange, it was about to escalate. The air felt heavier, thick with an unspoken weight that kept everyone frozen in place. Karoline could see it in the way some journalists avoided eye contact, others gripping their pens just a little tighter. They weren't just watching, they were waiting. The reporter, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp eyes and an unshakable posture, remained still. She leaned forward slightly, her pen resting against her notepad, a quiet smirk playing at the corner of her mouth. She wasn't here to ask a question, she was here to make a statement. Karoline straightened. "I'll say this one more time. If you have a relevant question, I will answer it. But I'm not going to stand here and engage in bad faith arguments." The reporter chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Bad faith? Karoline, I'm doing my job. Isn't that what a free press is for?" Karoline didn't blink. A free press is about holding people accountable. What you're doing is trying to turn this into a spectacle. A few murmurs rippled through the room as journalists exchanged quick glances, sensing the shift. This back and forth was no longer about policy, it had become something else entirely. It had shifted into something else now. The reporter tapped her pen against the table once, a calculated pause before delivering the inevitable. "So just to be clear," Karoline already knew what was coming. "Are you refusing to answer because you can't or because you don't want to?" A silence fell over the room as a few reporters inhaled sharply, bracing for what came next. Karoline exhaled, keeping her response measured. "I am refusing to play a game. This press conference is not about you." For the first time, the smirk on the reporter's face flickered, just for a moment, before she leaned back in her seat, arms crossed. "Right, because expecting transparency is a game." This time, the reaction wasn't just a murmur. Some journalists whispered to each other, while others glanced toward Karoline, waiting to see how she would handle it. She had faced tough reporters before, but this was different. This wasn't about policy, it was about control, about who could steer the conversation. Karoline adjusted the microphone slightly, then took a step back from the podium. "I think we're done here." The words sent a ripple through the room. The reporter's eyebrows lifted. "Excuse me?" Karoline didn't flinch. "You've made it clear you're not interested in an actual discussion. You're looking for a headline. If you'd like to stay and listen to the rest of the press conference, you're welcome to. But I won't be answering any more of your questions." The reporter let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "So, silencing the press? Got it." Karoline's jaw tightened, she knew this was coming. She knew exactly how it would be spun the second the cameras stopped rolling. But she also knew there was no winning with someone like this. Without a word, she glanced toward security, a subtle, unspoken signal, and just like that, everything shifted. People stirred in their seats, the energy in the room snapping from tense anticipation to full-blown confrontation. This was no longer just an argument, it was about to turn into something much bigger. A ripple of unease passed through the room. Journalists weren't just watching anymore, they were recording, capturing every second, every movement, waiting to see just how far this would go. The hum of camera shutters filled the space, freezing the exact moment Karoline glanced at security. The reporter caught it too, her smirk disappeared. "You're seriously doing this?" she asked, her voice lower now, but sharp enough to cut through the room. Karoline didn't answer. A uniformed officer by the door took a slow step forward. He didn't need to speak, the message was clear. The reporter had two choices, de-escalate or double down. She chose the latter. "This is unbelievable," she muttered, shaking her head. Then, louder, making sure the cameras caught every word, "So much for freedom of the press, huh?" Karoline remained still. Freedom of the press doesn't mean hijacking a press conference. The reporter let out a dry laugh, scanning the room as if daring the other journalists to side with her. Some shifted uncomfortably, a few scribbled notes, but no one spoke. The security officer took another step forward. For a split second, the reporter hesitated. She could stand her ground, force them to physically remove her, that would be a viral moment. Or she could get up, walk out on her own terms, and control the narrative another way. Karoline watched as the decision played out behind the reporter's eyes. Then, slowly, the woman reached for her notepad. She stood, adjusting the strap of her bag. "This is a disgrace," she muttered under her breath, just loud enough for the mics to pick up. And then, one final jab before heading toward the exit, "You can kick me out, but you can't silence the truth." Karoline didn't respond. The door closed behind the reporter, and just like that, it was over. Or at least, it should have been. The silence that followed was heavy, uncertain. No one knew what to do next. The cameras were still rolling. Some journalists kept their eyes down, pretending to scribble notes. Others just stared. Then, from the back of the room, a voice broke through. "Karoline, do you think this was the right decision?" She turned toward the journalist who had spoken. "I think it was necessary." Another voice followed. "You don't think this will backfire?" She did. She knew by the time she left this room, the internet would already be flooded with clips. She could already see the headlines, "Karoline Leavitt removes reporter for asking tough questions." But did it matter? She straightened her posture. "We're here to have discussions, not disruptions. If anyone else has real questions, I'm happy to answer them." A brief hesitation, then, slowly, a hand went up. The press conference continued, but the real storm was only beginning. Within minutes, the footage would spread like wildfire, and by the time Karoline stepped off the podium, her name would already be trending. As she walked down the hallway toward her office, her phone buzzed nonstop. Staff members hovered near the edges of the room, whispering in hushed tones, their faces tense as they glanced between their screens and the door the reporter had walked out of just minutes ago. Karoline didn't need to check her notifications to know what was happening, the clip was everywhere. An aide hurried to catch up with her, phone in hand. "It's already trending. Hashtag silencing the press is picking up steam." Karoline exhaled through her nose. "Of course." The aide hesitated. "The major outlets are running with it. Some headlines are fair, just reporting what happened, but others," she trailed off, scrolling. "Leavitt shuts down press freedom. Reporter escorted out for speaking truth to power." Karoline stopped walking, letting out a half laugh, half scoff. Speaking truth? She wasn't speaking truth. She was performing. The aide nodded. "Doesn't matter. That's not how it's being framed." Karoline had seen this coming the moment she locked eyes with security. The way these moments played out was almost predictable now. Clip the tension, cut out the context, slap on a dramatic headline, and let the outrage machine take care of the rest. Still, as frustrating as it was, she wasn't about to panic. She had been in politics long enough to know that narratives could shift. "What about our base?" she asked, pushing open the door to her office. The aide followed. "They're backing you. Conservative commentators are calling it a win, saying you handled it with professionalism. The usual names are defending you." Karoline nodded. "And the White House?" The aide hesitated. "They're distancing themselves, but they're not condemning you, yet." That last part hung in the air as Karoline leaned against her desk, arms crossed. "And her?" The aide didn't have to ask who she meant. Scrolling again, she scanned the screen. "She's leaning into it. Already did a live interview calling it a chilling moment for press freedom." She glanced up, waiting for Karoline's response. "She's getting booked on every major network." Of course, she was. Karoline tilted her head back, staring at the ceiling for a brief second before pushing off the desk. "She wanted this," she muttered, "and we just gave it to her." The aide bit her lip. "So, what's the play here?" Karoline didn't answer right away. She walked to the window, looking down at the street below. Reporters were already gathering outside, waiting for her next move. She knew she had a choice: stay quiet and let the moment run its course, or get ahead of it before the narrative hardened. Her jaw tightened. The fight wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Outside, the noise was growing, reporters huddled on the sidewalk, cameras angled toward the entrance, waiting for a statement. Inside, Karoline remained still, hands resting on her desk as her aide scrolled through an endless stream of headlines. "They're split," one aide finally said. "Some are calling it justified, saying you handled an unprofessional disruption the way any press secretary should. Others," she hesitated, then sighed, "they're painting it as an attack on democracy." Karoline smirked, shaking her head. "An attack on democracy," she repeated, "for removing a reporter who refused to follow the rules?" Her aide didn't respond. They both knew the truth didn't matter, not in the fast-moving world of digital outrage. A second aide stepped in, holding up his phone. "She just posted her full statement." Karoline took a deep breath. "Let's hear it." The aide read from the screen. "Today, I was removed from a press conference for doing my job, asking tough questions. This administration claims to value transparency, but when faced with real scrutiny, they silence the press. This should alarm every American who believes in accountability and free speech." Karoline let out a short laugh. "And let me guess, no mention of how she disrupted the entire event?" The aide shook his head. "Nope. Just playing the victim." "Of course. It was all so predictable: the selective editing, the carefully framed posts, the dramatic claims of suppression." Karoline had seen this game played before, and now she had a choice. Her first instinct was to go on offense, call a press briefing, lay out exactly what had happened, and remind the public that removing a disruptive journalist was not the same as silencing the press. But she knew how that would play out. The moment she engaged, the cycle would keep spinning. She turned back to the window. Outside, a news van pulled up, another reporter stepping out with a microphone in hand. The coverage wasn't slowing down. She tapped her fingers against the desk. "What's our strongest play?" The first aide hesitated. "We could release the full unedited footage before her version gets too much traction. Let people see for themselves how many times you warned her before security stepped in." The second aide nodded. "That way, it doesn't look like a defensive move, just transparency." Karoline considered it. It was a smart move: let the facts speak for themselves. But she also knew that facts alone didn't win battles, perception did. Her eyes flicked back to her phone, where notifications kept rolling in. She could already predict the cable news segments, the outraged panel discussions, the op-eds dissecting her decision. A long breath in, a slow exhale, then she nodded. "Release the full footage." The aides moved quickly, drafting a statement, queuing up the video. Karoline watched them work, her mind already 10 steps ahead. The reporter had wanted a spectacle, but what she didn't realize was that Karoline wasn't just reacting, she was setting the stage for what came next. The full, unedited footage went live within the hour. No flashy edits, no dramatic commentary, just a simple post with the raw exchange, letting people see exactly what had happened. The title was clear and direct: "Watch for yourself, the full exchange between Karoline Leavitt and the reporter at today's press conference." Karoline sat back in her chair, watching as the numbers ticked upward, thousands of views in minutes, comments flooding in, some furious, some supportive. Her phone buzzed, a message from a close ally in the media. Smart move. This takes the wind out of their sails. But she knew it wasn't that simple. The spin was already in motion. The reporter had gone on multiple networks, retelling the story in a way that painted herself as the victim. Karoline clicked on one of the interviews. There she was, seated in a dimly lit studio, brows furrowed in righteous indignation. "I was simply doing my job," she told the anchor. "I was asking tough but necessary questions, and instead of addressing them, I was removed." That should worry everyone, regardless of political affiliation. The anchor nodded solemnly. "Did you feel threatened?" Karoline rolled her eyes. "Threatened?" The reporter's sigh was almost theatrical. "Not physically, no, but professionally?" "Absolutely. This is an attack on journalism itself." The interview cut to a panel of experts, all weighing in. A dangerous precedent. A disturbing moment for free speech. She was just doing what journalists are supposed to do. Karoline exhaled sharply, locking her phone screen. The facts were out there, but that didn't mean people would accept them. Her aide peeked into the office. "You're gonna want to see this." Karoline followed her to the hallway, where staff had gathered around a TV tuned to a conservative network. The host was playing the full clip, the one Karoline had released, pausing at key moments. "She interrupts over and over," he said, shaking his head. This wasn't journalism. This was grandstanding. The panelists nodded. "This was a setup," one of them added. "She knew exactly what she was doing. Push until she gets removed, then play the victim." The host turned back to the camera. "Here's the reality: Karoline Leavitt didn't shut down the press. She shut down an activist posing as a journalist." Karoline crossed her arms, watching as the conversation played out. The split was clear. Conservative voices praised her for standing her ground, while mainstream outlets painted her as an authoritarian figure silencing the press. Her aide glanced at her. "This is going to be a long week." Karoline nodded. "Yeah, but at least now the truth is out there." The question was, who would believe it? The story refused to die. For days, it dominated headlines, talk shows, and social media debates. Political commentators dissected every second of the exchange, each side twisting the narrative to fit their agenda. Memes flooded the internet, some mocking the reporter, others portraying Karoline as a villain silencing free speech. But in the midst of all the noise, one thing became clear: the country was split. Karoline knew better than to expect a universal win. That wasn't how these battles worked. But as she sat in her office watching a clip of the latest panel discussion, something struck her. A veteran journalist, one she actually respected, leaned forward in his chair. "We have to be honest," he said. This wasn't a journalist seeking the truth. This was someone looking for a viral moment, and they got it. The other panelists shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to hearing this kind of honesty. She asked a question, got an answer, didn't like it, and kept pushing, not for clarity, but for conflict. And the moment she got removed, she ran straight to the cameras claiming victimhood. That's not reporting. That's activism. The host frowned. "So you're saying Karoline was justified?" The journalist shrugged. "I'm saying we need to be honest about what journalism is supposed to be. We're here to inform the public, not manufacture outrage." Karoline exhaled slowly. Finally, someone had said it. But she knew the damage was already done. The headlines had been written, the clips had been edited, and the people who wanted to believe she was suppressing free speech weren't going to change their minds. The people who supported her had already moved on, waiting for the next political battle. Her aide knocked softly on the door. You have an interview request from... No, Karoline said immediately. The aide blinked. You don't even know who it's from. I don't care, Karoline said, standing up. I'm not playing into this any further. The facts are out. Let them do what they want with them. The aide hesitated, then nodded. Understood. Karoline grabbed her phone, scrolling through the endless notifications. The storm would pass, it always did, but she knew this wasn't just about one press conference. It was about something bigger. The way the media operated now. The way narratives were crafted. The way truth was becoming secondary to clicks and outrage. She looked back at her aide. Release one last statement. What do you want it to say? Karoline thought for a moment, then smiled. Just 4 words. The aide waited. Karoline nodded. Watch the full video. Because at the end of the day, that was all that mattered, the truth, whether people wanted to see it or not. Media integrity was a fragile thing in an era where clicks mattered more than context, where the line between journalism and activism blurred more each day. The real question wasn't whether Karoline was right or wrong, it was whether society valued truth enough to recognize when they were being manipulated. What do you think? Let's hear it in the comments below. And if you want more content like this, hit that subscribe button.